Okay, so we're going to jump into our next presentation here. We have our two wonderful TTP technicians. If you haven't met them, you will meet them here momentarily. So first we have Meg. Meg has been fascinated by bees ever since she was a young child. During her first year at the University of Guelph, where she majored in biological science, she decided to take a course on bees that resulted in a deeper understanding and appreciation of honeybees. Ever since, she has been pushing her family to begin beekeeping and hopes to have her own hives soon. Charlize Wand attended the University of Guelph and completed her degree in marine and freshwater biology with a minor in ecology. Although Charlize's degree surrounds aquatic life, she has always had a desire to learn about and work with honeybees. Charlize was first introduced to beekeeping as a child when her family started a small hobby apiary in 2014. And I feel very old thinking that 2014 was a child, but I guess that's the life I live. Okay, so we're going to jump right in here with Charlize and Meg.
Hello, I am Charlize. Today we're doing a presentation for you on the role of queen size on honeybee queen fertility. This is a literature review kind of presentation, so it's not based off information we did with an experiment ourselves or our own observations. It's done with other people's scientific studies. So what is a high quality queen? Lots of our studies find that a high quality queen have traits specifically like gentleness, low swarming ability, hygienic behavior, all of those kind of economic traits that breeders currently breed for. But the ones we are currently going to be discussing today with queen fertility are traits like brood production, offspring viability, as well as longevity. Body mass has been previously used as a determinant for a quality of a queen. So the actual weight of her body. We find that with our reading that other morphometric traits such as thorax width or abdomen length can also be used possibly to determine what a quality of a queen is. And these all kind of relate to her reproductive capacity.
So when we were reading these papers and we're looking into reproductive capacity, we want to explain a little bit about what researchers use to actually look at fertility and measure it. So one of the main things that they'll use is the spermatheca. Everyone here probably knows what that is, but if you don't, it is just the organ that queen bees use, and it holds all of the sperm that they collect on their mating flights. So researchers will look at the size of the spermatheca to measure their fertility. This is usually they use the diameter or they use the volume of the spermatheca. So a high quality spermatheca is going to be about 1.2 millimeters in diameter and 1.2 millimeters in diameter and 0.9 cube millimeters in volume. So they'll look at that, they'll look at the size, and the larger the spermatheca usually is correlated to a larger number of sperm. So that is going to translate to her longevity. The more sperm that she is going to hold, the more eggs that she can fertilize throughout her lifetime. So she will lay fertilized eggs for longer. And they will be viable for longer. Researchers will also look at the ovaries. So this is just a diagram showing the anatomy. So those big seed pod looking things are her ovaries, and within the ovaries are her ovarials. These are the long tubes that hold her eggs. So when measuring her reproductive capacity, a measurement that they're going to look at is the number of her ovarials. The more ovarials that she has, the more eggs she has. Again, this means that she will most likely be laying for a longer amount of time, viable eggs, and is less likely to be replaced by the colony.
So ovary mass has also been previously used to be determining like what a queen quality could be. But the ovary mass is actually a very plastic trait of a queen. And this is because as she has more eggs in her ovary at a given time, those ovaries will be heavier. So if she's not producing as many eggs at a given time, those ovaries will shrink a little bit just because those ovarials won't be producing as many eggs. So periods of time where she will be lighter are actually like in the winter when she's not laying as much, or when the colony is quite crowded and Again, she won't be laying too frequently, or when she's been caged for quite a while. Those are all times where she will be lighter versus heavier. So hopefully it's a very plastic trait.
So a couple other things that researchers commonly use to measure a queen's reproductive capacity are her mating ability. So this will usually be measured as her mating frequency, or there's another thing called her effective paternity frequency. So mating frequency is just the absolute number of drones that she mated with. Effective paternity frequency is a little more complicated. It is the number of offspring. I don't really know how to explain it, but it's the number of offspring. If she's not getting an equal number of sperm from every drone that she's mated with, then the paternal figure, I guess, for her offspring, the proportions will be different. So the effective paternity frequency kind of equalizes that. They will also look at her brood production. So her egg laying rate, a good queen will be laying a little more than 2,000 eggs a day, hopefully. And then also egg viability. And then they will also look at vitellogenin levels. So this is a protein that is commonly found in fat bodies. When a queen mates, it will change her fat body composition and it will result in more vitellogenin. So you'll see later on, larger queens with bigger weights are going to have more vitellogenin. This is more correlated to more fat bodies, but it is a good thing to look at. Oh, and vitellogenin is also, it can be a marker of longevity. It's an antioxidant. And yeah.
So are heavier queens more fertile? When we've been reading the papers we use for our literature review, we found that queens at emergence, so when they come right out of the queen cell, the heavier ones will be above 200 milligrams in weight. And we have found that the papers found those specific queens had larger spermathecas, higher amounts of spermatozoa. They had higher acceptance rates when being introduced into newer colonies. They had higher mating successes. They had heavier ovary masses, a higher number of ovarials, again, those things that produce the eggs within the ovaries. They actually oviposited earlier, and they had, again, the higher vitellogenin levels. I'm sorry, I can't say that word. So one of the papers we did find for our literature review was also kind of a meta-analysis. And don't worry about reading all of that because I know you can't see them, any of those words, but it's kind of just a kind of proof of how many people have recognized specific morphometric body size and fertility traits, correlations and trends over time throughout studies. And it is quite a few. As per science in normal times, or as usually in science, there are also sometimes you find those correlations that kind of conflict with other people's findings. So we did find a few of those ourselves. One paper we did read found that there's no correlation, no correlation between the body mass and the ovarial number of a queen, but they specifically used emergency queens. So that was a unique situation for their paper. A second paper we found that body weight increased as ovarial number decreased, which is different than, again, what we found. And our third paper found that weight and ovarial number correlated only with artificially inseminated queens versus naturally mated queens.
So there's another interesting study that we read while we were doing all of our research. That came from Delaney et al. 2011. But I'll try to explain this graph to you guys. Basically, we're looking at body weight, and that is usually the marker that people use to determine quality. But this study actually found that there is a very significant positive correlation between body weight and then other physical morphometric parameters. So here in this weight, that top row is her weight. And then below there's thorax width, head width, the right wing length, and the left wing length. And then don't worry about the bottom row because it's not important. But all of those things were positively correlated. So basically what that shows is just as you would expect, if you have a queen that weighs more, her body is going to be a bigger size, which is kind of common sense, but it's nice to have it like scientifically proven here. So another interesting thing that that study found is that, like I said, the body weight increase was associated with increases in all these morphometric characteristics. One of them is the thorax width. That's something that's commonly measured in these papers. And they found that thorax width was also significantly positively correlated with the effective paternity frequency, which is what I was trying to explain earlier. So that is her mating frequency. It's basically how well mated she is. And then effective paternity frequency is also positively correlated with sperm count. So the more she mates, the more sperm she's going to have. And it's not on this graph, but that paper also found that thorax width and sperm count were also positively correlated. So all of this to say, if you have a queen with a higher mass, she most likely is going to have a wider thorax, and that for some reason will predispose her to have a higher sperm count and to be better mated. And this paper tried to explain why that might be, because as I mentioned earlier, it suggests that queens with larger thoraces are predisposed to mate with more drones. So one of the explanations that they came up with was that the larger the thorax, the larger the flight muscles. And so that means that she can mate for longer, basically, because she can fly for longer. That contradicts multiple studies, though. There have been studies that have found that there is no effect of flight duration on mating number or sperm storage. And there's also studies that found that there are negative correlations between sperm number and flight duration. So it may not be the best explanation, but as this paper also pointed out, there are so many confounding variables when you're doing studies that are looking at her mating number, her flight duration, because there's just so much going on. Another explanation they came up with was that thorax width is just a good proxy for spermatheca volume. So like I said earlier, spermatheca volume, the higher the volume, the more sperm she's able to hold. So for whatever reason, if she has a wider thorax, she could have a bigger spermatheca volume. But at the end of the day, at the time of this study, which was in 2011, so it was a long time ago, it's unclear why that correlation exists, but they did find that it exists. Other important and interesting things that we found while reading was the difference in body weight between imported stock into Canada and domestic stock into Canada. And there are not many studies on this, but there are a couple that we were able to get a little bit of data. So this one was done in 2023, and it looked at the difference between BC queens and then queens imported from New Zealand and Hawaii. And they did find clear differences between the three groups. One of the most interesting differences they found was that New Zealand queens weighed 10 to 13% less on average than BC and Hawaii queens. However, as Charlize mentioned earlier, ovary mass is a plastic trait, and queens can basically shrink their ovaries, especially when they've been caged for a long time. So because the New Zealand queens had the longest transit time, they would have been caged for the longest. The researchers said that that could be a reason for that weight drop, is that because ovary mass is such a big part of their weight that it just caused a decrease. The other interesting finding was that queens from Hawaii had smaller heads, thoraces, and spermathecas than queens from BC and New Zealand. So I think what is interesting to take away from this study is that just overall, it was the imports that had these smaller traits, and BC queens didn't. Again, it's just one study, but it is interesting. This is a little bit more data that we got from Brendan Daisley from the University of Guelph, who was kind enough to share it with us. This is not published data yet, so it's still in the beginning stages. But he found that domestic queens weigh more than foreign queens, which again is just very interesting. So again, we've related all of these traits of queens weighing more to their fertility. And if we are finding that domestic queens weigh more, it could say something about our queens and their fertility in comparison to imports. But I think more research needs to be done on it, more studies needs to be done on it to make any kind of say on that. There's also so much variability between breeders and within breeding operations. So it's hard to say like that Ontario has bigger queens.
So there are things that affect both the fertility traits and morphometric traits of queens that you as a breeder may be able to possibly control minorly or certainly observe. So a lot of the papers we read did actually find cup width affects some of these things. I'm specifically referring to the inner diameter of the queen cups. The researchers look at anywhere between 9 to 10 millimeters in width again for the cells. And they found that queens reared in the wider cups, I shouldn't say cells, cups, have wider and longer thoraxes. The vitellogelin amount in their ovaries also increases. There's more royal jelly left over in those cups after they've emerged. Body mass increases, and they also have both wider and longer abdomens. The age of the grafted larva that studies use also affected the trends they see. We did even have a study that found a way to graft 2-day-old eggs into cups, and they did use that as a parameter, as well as 1, 2, and 3-day-old larvae. So they found that the younger the transfer was, the wider and longer the thorax got, the longer their wings got, they had heavier body masses, longer abdomens, bigger ovary sizes, which again is a plastic trait, but on average they were a little bit bigger. They had larger spermathecas, more ovarials, longer queen cells versus cups, and they actually had a more regular gene expression for queen traits. So the paper that looked at the egg specifically, that's where my colorful picture comes from. Don't worry about reading any of the numbers. What I just want you to see is that the yellow means regular gene expression for reproduction, longevity, immunity, and metabolism traits of queens. And 80% of the reproduction, longevity, immunity traits that they were looking at for these queens, as the transfer age got older, they were more downregulated. A number of cells may be something you could look at also in your colony, and they found that as there were fewer cells within a colony, the abdomens of their queens got larger. There is also a genetic component to all of these morphometrics and fertility traits. Specifically, the papers we looked at different breeding programs within similar regions, and overall, they all found that different breeding programs have different ranges of sizes for these morphometrics. And the morphometrics include body mass, thorax width, head width, spermatheca volume, and sperm viability specifically. So all of those things have an effect via genetics. You can observe for the time of emergence for your queens too. Our researchers found that the younger the grafted larva was, the sooner she emerges. So they found that specifically the paper that did the transferred eggs actually hatch 18 hours sooner than the 3-day-old larva. So if you've ever had that situation where a queen emerged too early in your cell builder and she kind of chewed through some of those other cells, it could be, I'm not saying it is, but it could, oh my gosh, I did it again. It could be she's actually the younger queen. And again, with time of emergence being sooner, their oviposition was also sooner. So heavier queens oviposit sooner. And they found that they lay 1.3 days sooner than lighter queens. And again, that heavier queen being the over 200 milligrams in emergent size. Environment also has effect on these morphometrics. as does it on many things. And this includes both sperm viability and the amount of royal jelly produced for those cells. And these kind of depend on the season.
Okay, so now we've kind of summarized all of this data that we found from all of these papers. And as a breeder, yes, you can select for certain traits that might increase your queen's body mass, but also as a customer, when you're buying queens, is it something that you can look at to sort of assess the quality of the queens you're buying? And I mean, in our opinion, from reading all of this, I'd say it's something that you have to be very wary of as a measurement of quality because, as we've mentioned, it is so variable, the weight, and it changes throughout a queen's life. So it's hard to have a standard number where, oh, if she's over that number, then she's a high quality queen. In a lot of these studies, the number that they used usually was over 200 milligrams at the time of emergence. If you're buying queens, you're not really going to be able to weigh her at her time of emergence, I guess, unless you're buying cells. So it's hard to use it as a measurement of quality. By the time you buy a mated queen, she's already going to be laying, and her weight will actually probably be more than this if she is heavy, a 200 milligram metric. So yeah, it's hard to make a measurement for quality with that. And again, it's so variable with anything with science and beekeeping. Just because she is heavier too, it's not always going to mean that she's high quality. There's so many other confounding factors that are going to affect her quality and her fertility. So the most accurate measurements that people would suggest, especially in these papers, is if you could take a year-round average weight of a queen and then compare that between queens, but they don't actually give like how often you should be taking that weight. I feel like when we were speaking about it among ourselves, it was maybe a monthly weight and then find the average of that. Or as breeders, if you're taking subsamples of your population and maybe you're weighing like 10 queens and finding the average of that. But also there were papers that found the amount of variability within an operation was actually more than the variability between operations. So if you're rearing queens, they're going to be all over the place in terms of size probably. So yeah, that's kind of the conclusion is body mass obviously has been shown to be correlated with a lot of these fertility characteristics. And I think it is a good indicator of her fertility and her quality, but it's not a tell-all if you're weighing your queens. It can't be the only thing that you depend on. Yeah, that is our talk.